Hello, I'm Matti, and this is Grief Liberation Conversations in Community. Welcome. Here's a little bit about me. I'm a senior at Naropa University, studying psychology with a minor in gender studies. I'm a non binary, transgender, disabled, and neurodivergent person. I enjoy deep conversations and learning, especially topics like grief and the dying process, psychology and liberation psychology, white supremacy, whiteness, and a little bit of virtual reality. In my free time, I enjoy playing games, listening to music, creating art, and connecting with people. I believe storytelling is such an impactful way to connect and resist within community. I aspire to be a death doula and grief coach. I hope you'll enjoy your time listening to this podcast as I dive into the topic of grief with other people here. For this first episode, I've asked my friend James to ask me questions so that you, the audience, know why this is important to me. Thank you, James, and welcome.
Thank you. Hi, I'm James. I am not your host, but I will be playing the role for a scant period of time in this episode. I am a cis man. I design games for a living, and I have known Matti for, we talked about before this recording, over 2 decades at this point, which was a surprise to both of us, as I can still remember the first time, and I actually have a chip in my tooth that you had nothing to do with. It's from a wine bottle, but it is a relic of that very first meeting. And it's nice to be here.
Well, thank you. What are your pronouns?
Oh, my pronouns are he, him. Thank you.
Yeah, and mine are they, them. So, I would like to start with an exercise called the physiological sigh. I will be doing this in each episode to start, just to kind of allow our bodies to settle a little bit into this kind of content. The physiological sigh is a technique that I use myself when I'm feeling anxious and need to feel grounded. And so I thought that would be a good way to start each episode. And the physiological sigh starts with a deep inhale and then a sip of air just after. You hold for 4 seconds and then exhale slowly for 6 to 8 counts. So it sounds kind of like hold for 1, 2, 3, 4, and exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I figure we'll give this a go together and see how we feel after. So let's go. Okay, how do you feel?
A little bit more relaxed than I did a few moments ago. Even, well, I say even physically, like they're different things, but I can notice the tension in my shoulders from shoveling the driveway right before this has relaxed a bit. And yeah, wild what breathing does, huh?
Right.
Well, yeah, without further ado, in all the future episodes of this podcast, Maddie, you are going to be doing the interviews, the interviewer. And in this one, you're turning the tables a bit. You will be the interviewee. And so let's put you on the spot a bit. And we will start with a question. You have told me that you plan to ask everyone that's ever going to be on this show, and I think it's a great question. What is your definition of liberation?
Yeah, so my definition of liberation, for some context, comes from the idea of liberation psychology, which liberation psychology originated in the 1970s, 1980s from a El Salvadorian Jesuit priest and psychologist while the El Salvadorian Civil War was going on. He was trying to name things that hadn't really been named before, like how oppression and violence and poverty affects marginalized populations. And his name is Ignacio Martin Barrow. And yeah, so this theory is relatively new. This liberation psychology thread is relatively new. And so, coming from that context, and then also the context of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, also in the 1980s, and she's a lawyer and an activist and an advocate. And in the 1980s, she was helping a woman, a black woman, who was being discriminated against. And it was important that intersectionality was part of that context when they went to court. Because it wasn't just the fact that she was a woman that she didn't get this job, it's the fact that she was a black woman, and that context matters. So, the convergence of liberation psychology, intersectionality, kind of informs my definition of liberation, and that is to be not only free from oneself and the kind of chains that we put around ourselves in order to fit within society, but also being free from societal constraints and knowing that our intersecting identities can really inform our experience of liberation and how easily we can get there or how difficult it is to get there.
Now, this is a little bit of like, well, it does what it says on the tin, but my next question is why is that important? Or perhaps better, why is naming it important?
Well, it hadn't been named before the 1980s. So again, this is relatively new. Naming things, it can be empowering. And I think that's really important. I think the tricky thing is, though, naming our identity and being proud, it can also be met with oppression due to those same identities. And so me as a trans person, a non-binary person, a disabled person, a neurodivergent person, that might be empowering for me. And it might be weaponized by other people to keep me oppressed. And so I think it's important to talk about it because it's a way of resisting. It's a way of showing up and showing up for community and saying, hey, I have survived this and I'm still here. I'm still resisting. I am still feeling empowered and have a sense of self and purpose. And I feel like that can light a fire within community. When you see a person who is really committed to themselves and their own liberation, that gives other people permission to reflect on themselves and try to find that within themselves.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really good, which I think is a great segue as we talk about identities and how they both shape how other people see us and how our interactions with the world. Before we dive farther in, what do you see as your lenses you're looking at all of this through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first and foremost, I am white and I am mask presenting. And so that gives me privilege. Even if I don't pass as, cis all the time, I still can pass. And that gives me an enormous amount of privilege. So just because I am trans, non binary, disabled, and neurodivergent doesn't mean that my experience is a monolith. It's not everybody's experience, especially with the context that I am white and mask presenting. Even if I don't identify as a man or a masked person, I can't control how other people perceive me. And so I have to lead with just trying to show up in a way that feels safe for me and in a way that is authentic while not trying to suck up all the air out of the room the way that some cis white men can do in certain spaces. So I'm a lot more aware of how I can be perceived. And having a feminine experience for over 30 years, I can relate to the feeling of not feeling safe with people who now look like me.
Yeah, as someone who has a lot of privilege, hearing things like that will often give me a pause because privilege is blinding, and it often gives me a chance to actually reflect and be like, "Oh, right. This is, it's almost like the more privilege you have, the less you need to think of it, of course, right?" But in any case, so yeah, this podcast, we are here to talk about grief. You're going to be continually here to talk about grief. And fundamentally, if we're going to talk about grief, we should probably know what that is, or at least what that is to you. Because I'm sure if anyone is listening to this right now, there's a good chance that grief has impacted their life in some manner. And as you said, naming things can give it power. So if I were to ask you, what is grief? Which seems like it could be the world's biggest or smallest answer. What would you say?
Yeah, I would say that grief is such a big emotion that is disguised as other emotions that us in Western society do not learn about. And what I mean is, like, when people are feeling grief, it can show up as anger. Grief can show up as sadness. Grief can show up as a lot of different things. And it doesn't just come from one thing. A lot of people associate grief with death, but there's so much more grief than that. There's like grieving an aging body, there's grieving a disabled body when it wasn't disabled before. There's grieving life transitions, like transitioning from childhood into adulthood and realizing, like, I don't have the same innocence I once had, or I have to be a responsible adult. There's grief with being passed up for like a work promotion or not getting a job that you really wanted or not connecting with a person. Like, grief is hidden, and it is way more pronounced than I think we realize. And through my own grief, my experience with grief, I've also learned that grief is something that slows us down. And when we don't slow down and we don't process it, it just gets compounded. And the more grief we experience, the more it compounds. And every time we experience grief, it just gets bigger and bigger because we're not just grieving these individual things anymore once it's compounded. We're grieving everything that we didn't process before.
That was a lot of great stuff, and I have some follow up questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that grief slows you down,
Mm-hmm.
and not specifically you, but the royal you, the everyone you. What do you mean by that?
So, in my experience, grief needs to be witnessed, and that means stepping out of society for a moment. Like, we need to take a pause on life to really acknowledge what's happening. So, in a world that is in Western society, in a world that's run by capitalists and patriarchy and white supremacy, we align ourselves with like so many values like perfectionism and work ethic as worth, and like the worshiping of the written word, and just all these different values that we kind of step away from when we actually experience grief because we're not working, we're not moving in this fast paced world at the same rate. We are pausing and going inward for a moment and just experiencing that grief if we allow ourselves to, anyway. And within that grief, it means that it feels like the world is just whizzing on by when we take this pause and we go into this kind of like reflection mode where we're processing what it is that we are grieving. So if it's the loss of an ability or the loss of a loved one, that can take some time to process. And if we don't take that pause and we just keep moving and pretend like it didn't happen, that's what creates that compounded grief. And I think that's where a lot of people sit because grief is so uncomfortable. So it causes us to slow down, kind of take stock in what's important, especially with loss of a loved one. We see the world differently. We are met with our own mortality in a different way when we deal with that type of loss. We are reminded that we are going to die, and that's not a thought that is comforting for a lot of people because we live in a society that also pretends like death doesn't exist and it only exists for people who are weak and people who are not well and people who don't take care of themselves. But it comes for all of us.
It really is often seen as a personal fault, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've in my life, and again recently, I've had a good deal of friends who have dealt with addiction and being in active addiction and whatnot. And just thinking about what an experience rehab is in the sense of like, it's almost like that forced slow down to actually contend. And honestly, when I think about every single friend who has gone through this, there really seems to be also a an unhealthy relationship with grief that they had, you know?
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's interesting the parallels that's forming in my mind right now. Well, so you're working in grief now, and I'm sure that like any good superhero, you have an origin story. But before we get into the transformative experience with grief, like is there a time in your life you remember like your first experience with grief, even if you couldn't name it at the time?
Hmm.
And like me personally, I don't know that I'd be able to answer that because I have a terrible memory, but I'm curious about your experience with that.
Yes, and I think that that particular moment caused so much anxiety for me that that's actually the moment that my anxiety started.
Oh
My
wow.
lifelong anxiety.
What a gift it is to be able to
And
pinpoint.
sure, yeah, yeah. I won't go into specifics of this particular thing, but I was about 5 years old. There was a family situation, and I felt like I wasn't being heard and I wasn't being respected. And that stuck with me. Like, that stuck with me in a way that made me feel isolated and like, yeah, I would have to figure out so many things on my own. And at 5 years old, that's really devastating.
Yeah, that is not a great age to be figuring out anything, really.
Yeah, should be figuring out the order of trains in the. Maybe that's my neurodivergent brain, but putting
Yeah,
cars in
specifically
specific
like
orders.
5-year-old. Yeah. Square box, square hole type ordeal. So,
Uh,
okay, so before we started recording today, we were talking over some things that we wanted to talk about and whatnot, and you mentioned the term body grief. Could you define that for me?
ooh, yeah. Body grief is the grief that comes with having a body. There is a book called This is Body Grief by Jane Mattingly, which really spells this out clearly. And in it, she talks about so many different types of body grief. And it really landed with me. So, body grief for me personally has come from grief from different types of transitions, not the loss of my feminine body necessarily, but the loss of a changing body leading up to the transition, the grief that came with the age, the grief that came with becoming disabled, with being diagnosed with endometriosis, MCAS, interstitial cystitis, amongst other things. Like having a body that for a long time I felt like was fighting against me, now being at a point where I realize that my body is not fighting against me, it's trying to protect me, it's loving me the best way that it can, and like coming into this place of acceptance. And I highly recommend that book, This is Body Grief by Jay Manningley, to anybody who is experiencing body grief, whether it's from all the things that I've named, whether it's from aging or just having a body at all. It's really a powerful book.
We won't get into this too deeply, but I am kind of curious because I feel often, especially with the way you describe grief, it sounds like we don't always realize grief is happening when it is. And I imagine there are folks who are experiencing grief that never realize what it is. Is there a time during all the processes with your body that you recognized it for what it was, like where it officially felt like you were starting mourning or anything like that?
When I was injured in 2016, there's definitely a mourning period. There was a period where I really thought that I was going to get better and that the injury that I sustained was going to heal and I was going to be fine and I was going to be being super active. And that didn't happen. And then came the loss of people that I surrounded myself with because they didn't know how to contend with my loss. And I think that they saw that mirror up to themselves and realized their own fragility. And that was scary. So, yeah, I feel like that loss was the most challenging, but it was also the catalyst for huge change in my life. Not only did I leave that area, I moved away and I
Yeah.
really went inward and felt more aligned with my authentic self. And it took a while for me to get there and to feel safe enough to be in that place. But yeah, from the depths of that grief came joy, came liberation in a lot of different ways. Me liberating myself from the ideas that society put on me, how I was supposed to look and dress and behave and deal with like social interactions, like all of those things I deal with in a much more authentic way than trying to follow rules, which is what it felt like for a really long time. I had all these rules I had to remember. I go into conversations with like a list of things like, okay, I have these three topics at the ready. I know what I can talk about if there's a lull, and yep, I'm good to go. So like kind of releasing myself from all of that and showing up organically and authentically has been a really uplifting experience.
That's really great. I think oftentimes when we're younger people, and especially before transformative things like this happen, there's not a lot of intention about community. Community is just kind of a thing that happens. There's people around you. And you mentioned through this that a lot of those people went away. So I think you already hit on the isolation of that somewhat, and you are welcome to speak more on that if you'd like. But it sounds like it fostered a great sense of intention in you for a lot of things. Was there a community role in the grieving, or was there? was there intention around rebuilding community or anything you want to
Yeah.
say to that?
Within certain contexts, absolutely. There were times where I needed that isolation in order to find community, if that makes sense. Like, I needed to really slow down and check in with myself. And instead of performing in order to try to fit in spaces that I clearly, to me now, clearly didn't fit into, but I didn't understand that at the time. So being able to shed that version of me that was just trying to be loved by everybody that I met and hoping that somebody would just see me was really hard. So, like, going inward, having this experience, my body grief specifically, the person that I relied on actually most in my life for grief was my best friend. And she was my community for the longest time. She was the person that I went to with everything. And I felt so safe and held in a way that I never did before. I didn't get that level of safety when I was a kid. And I felt like through that relationship, I was able to build community and really see myself in other people. I thank her for that. That has been a great gift. She also introduced me to a lot of cool people, which is
Mm.
cool. I don't know if you know anything about what I'm talking about.
I was just going to mention, yeah, she is the reason we know each other. And think what's interesting about that is, yeah, when I think back to meeting you in context of her, which, like, yeah, I do have to say, as far as, and especially at that age, like early adulthood, when you have so much to figure out, and so many of us are hopelessly self obsessed because we're trying to figure those things out about ourselves. She was a person who excelled in actually being able to see you as a person. And I don't mean just you, I mean me, I mean everyone,
Yeah.
in a way that was always very inspiring. And it's interesting to think about that in like everything you just said in the context of, because I knew you during this time and also during now, and just to see you back in larger social situations back then, yeah, it's putting words to things that I guess I hadn't really thought about, and how cool it is to see you so much more comfortable
Yeah.
in everything. Really. Yeah. Well, it seems like, there's, I think there is more I want to ask you about community, but this also seems like a good spot to transition to, because I know that she was foundational to your
Yeah.
understanding of grief and your work in grief.
So I'm gonna start with how I met Jackie, and that was at work. She was an extrovert, and I've always been an introvert, and she yeah, she could make friends with anybody anywhere, and it I used to call her my emotional support extrovert because
Gotcha, as an extrovert.
she would get me to do things and be uncomfortable, and I didn't have anyone else that did that for me. But when I met her, she literally cornered me and didn't let me leave a room. She was trying to have a conversation with me, and I remember just like being terrified. Like, I did not, it's not that I didn't want to talk to her. I did, but I didn't because I was so uncomfortable being seen. And like we were just saying, she had this amazing ability to see everybody that she saw and to connect with people. And that was something that I had never experienced before. And so she literally corners me and doesn't allow me to leave this room. We joked how our friendship started very unhealthy
This is such a Jackie
because
story. This is great.
she controlled like that situation, but at the same time, like, I am so grateful for that because to know her, to have loved her, and to have been friends with her is like, it was such a gift. Yeah, she used to joke. She would say, I thank my lucky stars that I forced my friendship on you. Because that's quite literally what happened. And I needed that. Um, yeah. And before her, I didn't understand friendship. I didn't understand what it was like to be in relationship with another human being. Not really. And she was the first person that I really opened up to and that I shared personal experiences with. And she didn't judge me for it. And that was massively healing to not be judged for the experience that I had nothing but judgment prior. And I remember specifically just one day hanging out with her and I was like, I I just want to be around her because I feel my most authentic self when I'm around her. And I actually came out to her as trans at 18 when I came out to no one else. And I didn't officially come out to anyone else until I was about 32. And that was just friends. I didn't come out to my
Wow.
family until I was about 34.
Wow. I did not know that. That's amazing.
Yeah. So she held my secrets and I held her secrets. And it's funny too that like she was foundational in me building a foundation for myself, a foundation that I didn't really get, that I needed to kind of be a human, if that makes sense. Like, I needed to be seen, I needed empathy, I needed no judgment, like that true unconditional love I got from her and I felt from her. And I hadn't really felt that from other people. I had other people saying that they did love me unconditionally, but there was always some kind of transaction or it always came with some kind of caveat. Like it wasn't just plain and simple, this is this is just unconditional love. And it was with her. And so it was transformational and healing in so many different ways. And so I remember in 2016, I got injured. She tried to understand what that was like, and she couldn't. And then later that year, she was diagnosed with cancer. And when the pain started to set in, she apologized to me and was like, you were talking about pain, and I had no context for that. And now that I feel pain, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that I couldn't understand this sooner. And I'm sorry that I had to be where I'm at now to understand what pain is like. And so that deepened our relationship, my relationship to my changing, aging, and newly disabled body, and her with her cancer diagnosis and her changing body. And so in those moments, like, I wasn't going to go anywhere because I felt that isolation from other people that I never felt with her. In fact, when I moved to Vermont, there was a 3 month period where she was the only friend that I talked to because I was in such a bad headspace and I was so used to being the person that reached out. And I realized that that was my role in all these friendships. It was me taking on all of the responsibility, and I didn't have to do that with her. I didn't have to fight to be seen with her. And I'm so grateful for that. And then, the grief of losing her was the hardest thing that I've ever dealt with because it felt like I died with her, and I truly feel like a piece of me died with her. In the couple weeks leading up to it, we were still talking every few days. The texts had slowed down because, I mean, she wasn't doing well. And she had asked me to write her obituary for her. And I had to compartmentalize that. I felt so honored that she would ask me that. And I also felt like this deep responsibility. Like, how do I find words to describe this person's life and she's still here? Like, how can I do that? And I wrestled with in the last few months of her life too, like, was I really her best friend? Like, she had so many friends and she was able to make friends with so many people. And what I realized is that, like, in the beginning when she was diagnosed with cancer, people really were showing up for her. They were creating like food trains and stuff like that, and helping out. And then when the cancer went into remission and then came back, there were a lot less people that showed up that second time. And so I recognized that, but I didn't acknowledge it. I recognized that because I had felt something similar with becoming disabled and felt like community was falling away. And I didn't want to acknowledge it because I have dealt with unworthiness for most of my life. And even in the strongest and healthiest relationship that I ever had, which was with this person who is dying, I could not face the fact that she loved me and saw me as her best friend too. And so after literally moments after she died, I was there, and I remember thinking almost immediately, like, wait, she asked me to be here. There's not a bunch of friends here, it's family, and there's me. And I realized in that moment, it took her dying for me to realize how much she loved me. And that was so painful.
Yeah, that's a tough realization.
And through processing her death and being present with her at her death, and I did so much research. When we found out that she was terminal, I was watching Nurse Julie, who is a hospice nurse, and I was doing all the research on what to expect when someone is dying, and like what to look for, what are signs of the dying process, active dying process, and that kind of thing. And so I felt like I was training myself for this thing. It's wild. I had this connection with her that we always knew when to call each other. Like, we always just had this sense that something was wrong and we would call each other when we most needed it. She even got a care package that I sent on a day where she got some really bad news. And obviously I didn't time that. It was just like this weird cosmic like relationship that it felt like. When I was told, oh, we're going to try to celebrate this holiday early, if you can get down here, in my mind I was like, oh, she's still got a couple weeks. And so when I was on the plane, I'm like, I'm just going to write out this obituary real quick just in case. And so I wrote the obituary on the plane, and I put in a filler date, not knowing that that was actually the day she died. And not knowing that literally 24 hours she was going to not be on this like earthly plane with us anymore. And so the loss of her was so profound because it was like I lost the person that truly saw me, the person that was my ride or die and my platonic soulmate. We talked about growing old in the nursing home together, even though we were both partnered. Like, we were like, screw those other relationships. We're going to be the people that do this. And and it didn't turn out that way. So for me, grieving, it wasn't just grieving the loss of the most important person in my life, it was grieving the loss of opportunity. It was grieving the fact that if I hit any milestones, I wouldn't be able to experience that with her in the same way. And it also meant that that foundation that we built together completely crumbled. And I ended up going into a partial program because the grief was so severe. I could not get out of bed. I was out of work for about 3 months and I couldn't function. I couldn't function at all. And this intensive outpatient program taught me some DBT skills, which was really useful. Taught me some like emotional regulation and taught me how to process emotions for the first time. I had never learned how to do that.
Real quick,
And mhm.
DBT, just for anyone who's listening who doesn't
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, it's a dialectical behavioral therapy. My brain always wants to say diabolical, and I have to translate that in my head. It's not diabolical behavior therapy, because that would be something different. It is dialectical behavioral therapy.
Sorry to interrupt there, but in case anyone is standing by to Google, you know.
No, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, so that grief changed me completely. Experiencing that loss meant that I experienced life so differently. Another thing that I haven't shared is when I was a kid and up until my 30s, I dealt with suicidal ideation every day. It was something I could not block out at all, no matter how hard I tried. It was every day was a struggle to find a reason to live, to find a sense of worthiness, to find people who could see me and accept me. And I just wasn't finding that. And I had that one person that like saw me. And so this grief meant that I had to go inward instead of outward. Instead of asking other people to see me, I had to see myself. And I came out as trans before this happened, but I didn't start truly processing my grief, all of the compounded grief that I dealt with until the loss of Jackie. And it was so profound the moment that I realized that I finally processed everything beforehand. I had an uncle that I lost when I was 21 that I was close to, and that came up. And like all of the grief that I hadn't processed came up. And to be in a place now where I've processed all of that, now when I get those grief waves, when I do grieve her, as it happens, I'm not grieving the thousands of things that I was grieving before. I get to just grieve her. And that's a really beautiful and profound experience for me.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Definitely a lot of threads I want to pick at. So that story told me a lot of things. And one of the things I think it really brought up is how fundamental community, or perhaps lack thereof, or perhaps both, can be in grief, in the processing of grief, or how grief is perceived. What work are you aware of that's kind of been done in this area, or like what do you feel has yet to be done?
Well, there is research that shows that healing in community has a lot of benefits. It took a while for me to be able to find community to heal with because a lot of people in Western society, again, they see loss and grief as something that has a time limit. We get 3 days of bereavement pay when we lose a parent or a sibling or something like that. And that is wild. Or even like a spouse of 50 years, 3 days is not enough time to process grief. It's just not. And then that gets pathologized into you are not enough or you are too much. Honestly, it's you are being too much in these spaces where you should not be taking up this kind of space. So, being able to process grief in community doesn't mean that you're constantly in community, constantly outward, constantly going to shows and doing these things. It does mean like doing some work on the self and being fearless enough to ask for help and say, I need to be witnessed and sat with. And finding people who are willing to sit in uncomfortable spaces, who are able to sit with uncomfortable feelings and not try to excuse them away or tell you, it's going to get better. Or my least favorite thing that I heard was God has a plan. And it's like, that's not helpful for people who are grieving, especially if they aren't religious. What is actually helpful is sitting, just breathing with a person who is grieving, asking what they need if they have the capacity to answer that, and if they don't, offering ways to show up for them. Like, the reason why I'm getting into grief work is because I don't want other people to experience what I experienced after this loss. I needed people to show up for me, and the few people that I did ask to show up didn't know how. And then other people that I did want to reach out to, I was afraid of making their grief worse. And so having community, whether it is a person or a group of people or a support group or whatever it is, having people to just sit is so profoundly healing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Especially Jackie's community was so spread out. A, because she made friends wherever she went. B, she did some moving around in her life. And C, the types of friends she made did moving around in their lives. So yeah, it's interesting to think about that web. So I want to change direction a bit now.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think, going to start getting at something kind of foundational to this podcast as well, and that is queerness.
Mm-hmm.
And for, let's start with 101. Define queerness for me. What does that mean to you?
Well, for me, queerness is embodying difference. And what I mean by that is not being cis, straight, and just like heteronormative conforming. Queerness can be an identity that describes sexuality or gender. And for me, it's kind of both. My queerness is that I identify as a queer body, and my sexuality is also queer. Yeah.
Yeah, good and concise. So you mentioned grief being the pathway to joy in a queer community. How could something so painful be a pathway to joy, and what makes that specifically queer?
Queer bodies experience grief differently than bodies that are not queer. I mean, there can be grief with coming out and how that was received, either by family or friends or society, with contending within yourself that for me, that I was different. And I was living in Texas when I came out as a lesbian, and that was the best word that I had for it in the moment. And I don't identify as a lesbian now.
Yeah, I mean, and also to be fair, we are so much more knowledgeable
Right.
now than we just have access to so much more information now.
Right. The 90s, we had such limited verbiage for so many things. And yeah, so
It was also very much the era of the infamous Time magazine cover about bisexuals and
Hmm.
the greedy bisexuality.
Right.
Look out, world, a new sexuality has arrived.
Right.
But in any case,
Right. And I played with that sexuality for a little bit, but it didn't quite feel right. Like there were elements of bisexuality that felt right, but it wasn't exactly it. And, now I identify as pansexual, a little bit demi and a little bit sapio, but definitely pansexual. And yeah, being a kid living in Texas in the 90s and being outed as a lesbian, that was a terrifying experience. And so there was so much grief that I experienced through the harassment, the not being accepted by peers, and my favorite teacher stopped talking to me. Like, I was just in such an unsupported space. And so there is grief with being queer that people who aren't queer don't experience. And so the important part of community is finding people that share a similar experience. And not just for talking about the traumatic experiences, but finding space to kind of process that together and be like, oh, yeah, I had this experience as well. It feels better when you are not carrying that alone. It feels better to share the things that are taking up space in our hearts and have that be recognized than just taking that on our own. And to that end, there is joy that can be found, I think, because of grief. Because we experience grief, we have capacity for joy. Like, I can experience grief and joy together because the joy comes in the in between spaces. Like, even when I have those moments of grief with Jackie now, it's usually paired with joy that I got to experience her, joy that I had such a deep connection with her, and that she made me laugh. And she was so fiercely herself and created so many memories with me. I have joy within that. And I probably wouldn't see those moments as joyful had the grief not been there.
I have a lot of queer friends, and um, I often think about when it comes to the relationships in my life of any variety, just how much I've learned from queer folks. And I think it's kind of I think there's two big factors at play is that, cis hetero relationships, there is a very entrenched cultural playbook on how those are supposed to go and what they're supposed to look like, healthy or not. There's a standard that we are bombarded with and that a lot of people subscribe to. And not having a blueprint like that, I feel a lot of queer folks have had to map these relationships that don't have a map. And the processes they've used to do that and the theory and thoughts that have come from that are, in my mind, very wonderful things. And I think there's a relationship to community that is inherent with queerness that, yeah, I'm sure exists for many reasons. A, because of that intentionality I just mentioned, but B, also when you're not the majority in the cultural zeitgeist, it makes sense to seek out it always makes sense to seek out other folks whose experiences are familiar to your own. It's just, cis hetero folks don't have to try that hard. It kind of happens by default to the point. And this is privilege again, where you expect everyone sharing that same reality. So, yeah, do you have thoughts on queerness and community? And you've shared plenty already within the context of grief or out, but it just seems like a very intentional thing within queer communities or just queer folks in general to talk about community and think about community and actively seek it out with an amount of intention that is often not seen outside of that.
Yeah, there has to be intention behind it because there has to be safety, and that's part of the intention of being in a queer space is there needs to be a level of safety and having certain identities that I identify with. It is a place where I can go into queer community and be myself and not have to mask in a way that I might in other spaces. So, for instance, I think I shared this earlier, being a mask presenting person and also white, walking down the street, I may not seem like a safe person to other people, and that is up to everyone to decide, not me. And being in queer community means that I don't have to have that layer of masking. I can just kind of be and be in intentional spaces where we can just exist and breathe freely. For me, that's why the the shootings that happened at Pulse were so devastating because this was like a place where people escaped their daily reality. They would go there to dance and be with people like them. Like so many queer people have jobs that they are masking at. They're trying to tone down their queerness or they're not out as trans or like there's some kind of safety thing. So being in community is a space where you can be authentic and let loose, have fun, or depending on, the venue, be in connection with. And again, the Pulse shooting was so devastating because I just think about all the people that were there with all that context, like trying to escape whatever their reality is outside of what that club stood for. It stood for safety, it stood for connection, it stood for letting loose and being around people like them. That's so scary. That can be so scary for queer people. And so the intention found in queer community, I think, is also healing because of those connections. Like, we don't just want to be talking about the bad things that are happening to trans bodies and queer bodies. We want to have joy in it too. And so, queer community gives us a space where we can process grief, we can process the reality of our situations, and still make room for joy and experience that in community.
Just real quick, because I feel like any queer person listening understands. For folks who might not be familiar with it, and I think the reason will be obvious why they wouldn't. Masking. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So, masking, I usually think of in terms of like neurodivergence, but it is putting up a front when it is not safe to be authentic. A lot of people mask when they go to work, whether they are queer or not, meaning they're not coming to work with their full self. They're bringing their work self there. And so masking is just hiding parts of the self in order to protect the self.
Great definition there. Okay, so I just have a few more questions today about your work with grief. Yeah, I feel like you mentioned some of this in the opening today. Just to reiterate, why are you qualified to talk about this other than being a human being who's experienced grief, which is important for sure. I feel like most human beings, if not all, have that under their belts.
Sure. Yes, I've absolutely experienced grief, and I am using my thesis to explore grief. This podcast is starting out as part of my capstone project. And so I've been interested in grief for a long time, and I've been researching it for the last few years. And with my degree aligning with psychology, with a minor in gender studies, I feel like those two things are kind of converging here within this research. And the research is basically labeled grief as a pathway to joy and liberation in queer communities. So, learning about grief, reading so much about grief, and there's so many books that I can recommend to people on grief, but I will save that for later. But because grief is something that is experienced by everybody, it's not something that is limited. I think that it's really important to show my particular lens to this topic because yes, I have researched it and I've experienced it, and I am bringing to the table my unique lens as a trans, non-binary, neurodivergent, disabled person experiencing grief in all of those particular ways. Because there's not a lot of research on that nuance. There's not a lot of research on queer joy after grief.
Yeah, I appreciate the even just a mention of joy because I think it's often seen as so foreign to grief, and to see how those are connected are that's really nice. And I think you just answered everything I have in the next question, which was going to be why is this work important? I think you really hit it on the head. But just to make sure, is there anything else you want to say about that, or we kind of hit on the basis?
As I said before, grief can cause us to slow down and kind of take stock of what's important in our life. And I think one of the things that I think is important for me to share about my experience with grief is it has taught me that time is the most valuable currency that we have. I mean, I am literally sitting with people, I'm having a conversation with you, and I am giving my life force to sit here and connect with you. And that is worth way more than money. So time is the most precious currency that we have. And my hope is that people can reflect on that a little bit, because I think that's important. When we experience grief and process it, we can understand that, all these arbitrary rules that were made by cis able-bodied white men really don't have to apply for us to find joy.
I feel there's a lot of cis-able body white men who would feel better about their lives if they understood that as well. What would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions folks have about grief? As there seems, talking to you today, it seems like there's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this before that a lot of people associate grief specifically with death. I think, and there's obviously many different types of grief. I think there's another misconception around the time that it takes to process grief. Um, and that everybody processes grief differently. So the way that I experience grief is going to be very different from the next person. And the fact that that gets pathologized, if somebody grieves quote unquote incorrectly, is super problematic. So yeah, that's kind of my points on that.
No one gets to win the grieving Olympics, huh?
Exactly.
So this is episode 1 of this podcast, which is it's always nice to see an idea get off the ground. Do you have any major hopes or dreams about this podcast?
My hope is that people connect to it in some way or learn something. I know that grief can feel lonely. So even if somebody who listens to it who is grieving in some capacity or doesn't realize that they're grieving and learns through this podcast that they are and feels like they recognize themselves, I think that makes it worth it just there. My hope is that I continue to find people that want to talk about grief, knowing that this is a really difficult subject and not fun for a lot of people, but it just happens to be one of my special interests.
And it's very interesting because I feel whenever I hear someone talk about grief in a positive way, or how they got over grief or whatever, anything like that, there always comes to a moment of they experience X, Y, or Z and it helped them to feel so not alone. And so, yeah, I do hope that someone can get that from here. Maddie, this has been great. It's been great talking to you today. And I've known you for over 2 decades, we realized before this call. And I know more about you after this, even after all that time. And so, just before we go, I just have one final question. As, again, you have mentioned of grief being the pathway to joy. And I think a lot of people have a hard time kind of conceptualizing that, especially if they're not dealing with their grief, of seeing grief as anything other than the pain it causes and not something that there is another side to it all. It is something that you'll be mirrored in. Hey, what's bringing you joy lately?
Yeah, I am really appreciating the conversations with friends that I've been having, specifically on this topic. It brings me joy that people are meeting me and talking about difficult things when ordinarily that's not something we do as a society. So it brings me great joy that I'm connecting with so many people about this. It really just kind of fills my heart. Like I just feel so much lighter, even though this is such a difficult topic. Like I feel lighter talking about it. And I think that's just really beautiful.
That is really beautiful. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here today, for asking such great questions, and for being present with me through the subject. And I hope that listeners can connect with something and continue listening. I ask the listeners, and you too, James, to be kind to yourself, and I'll be here for the next episode. Hope you will be too.